like to welcome Michelle Miller, a cognitive psychologist, the author of Minds on Mind, Teaching Effectively with Technology. And so it is.
Hi. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for coming out on a Friday afternoon and choosing this talk to spend some time on. And I hope to make it a really rewarding experience and stimulate some creativity and perhaps some new questions about how you tackle learning challenges that we all face within our disciplines and within our courses. So, as John mentioned, I'm a psychologist by training. I'm a cognitive psychologist specifically. More people these days know what that means than they used to. It does mean that I focus my work on the side of the human mind includes things like memory, attention, problem solving, thinking, language, all those sorts of issues. And that's where I started out my research career. But like all of you, there came a time when I came to work at an institution, in my case Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, that really values and treasures teaching. And that's where I was really spending my time and reestablishing my intellectual life. So as I got further and further into that work and into that focus, I started to increasingly turn my attention to how my discipline and the findings of my discipline, cognitive sciences, brain sciences as well, could infuse new insights into what we do and allow us to do more and help students accomplish more in a wider range of disciplines and to a higher level. So I've been very excited in the past few years to also be talking with faculty across disciplines about those insights. And I'm by no means the only cognitive psychologist or learning scientist out there that has the idea to do this. But one of the things that I bring to it is also an understanding that we don't always make it easy within cognitive science to adapt and even identify the relevant findings. So that's also been a part of my perspective as well, and I hope to share with you here today, is really taking all of these findings that pile up every day, it seems like. And some of the fields we'll be talking about today have been the site of some incredibly vibrant activity over the last 10 to 15 years. Well, I mean, that's a great flurry of activity, but I've been trying to drill down and find out for the practitioners across disciplines outside of psychology, what are the most relevant things, the things that are most germane to teaching and learning, and identify those. In a way, that's the perspective I bring to the technology question as well. So, we've got Teaching with Technology is the title of this last project, and that's a big focus of why we're all here today and also tomorrow's workshop if you can attend that. And to me, the perspective is this. I mean, I come from a time, as probably some of you do, when the question with instructional technology was more, oh my gosh, is there a tool out there that might do something, that I might be able to somehow adapt for this course? And now the problem is really the opposite one. It seems like you go to bed at night and you wake up in the morning and there's 10 more instructional technology companies with 100 more products, and there's so many things that you could do. But there's only so much time and space in any given course. And I think that it's then increasingly important to have frameworks for why I would choose one thing over another. And that's one of the things that I hope to offer of value today. Frameworks for choosing technology and even ways to advocate for certain strategies for technology use and learning strategies with our colleagues and in our institutions. So what we're going to be touching on today are, first off, 3 areas of cognition, so more of those in a minute, that I think every teaching and learning professional should know about. Faculty, instructional designers, administrators, all of us who are involved in this enterprise should know about some of the highlights of these areas. We will also take a detour into a related area, so more on that in a second. But, as much as I started out focused on research, I'm also a really pragmatic, sort of practically oriented person. So I also want to plant the seed in your mind before we get into any of that stuff of another way to look at how we plan our learning experiences and plan our courses. And that's really examining the questions that we use when we walk into these situations of what am I going to do with my students and how. And I think that traditionally it's been very content driven, right? It's all been about you know, what textbook are we going to pick, and what are we going to cover, and which chapters are we going to leave out? And I think that we can kind of turn that around these days, and more people are starting to adopt this kind of a mindset. So some practical questions, and again, I just want to put in the back of your mind, are these. So yes, of course we want to think about what should students know. That's quite relevant. But I think we also want to be thinking about what should students be able to do. What can they not do at the beginning of this class or learning experience that they need to be able to do after? So what do you really want students to be able to do? Also looking at it in terms of time. So how many of you have had somewhere in your syllabus X number of hours outside of class have to be spent for reading? And then, yeah, we're very big on these in Arizona. So we put those statements in there and say, spend 2 hours of time outside of class. Well, great. Even if students are spending that time, how are they spending it? So I think more of us are kind of critically examining and saying, well, you know what, maybe we have more control over that than we think. But we have to think about that in the planning process. So picture that student at home diligently funneling that time and effort in. What do you think they're doing? So, you know, there's always assessment, everybody's favorite topic, assessment. And we also, of course, throughout our course, have measurements of student learning, right? But, of course, those measurements of learning are not just summative measurements. They can also be part of the learning process itself. And they affect the mood and the flow of the course. So there are some cases, as we'll touch on, where the ways in which we go about things, even like quizzing, can work for us or they can work against us. So looking at assessment in that new way. And lastly, that other topic outside of cognition that I've grown to believe and understand really can't be separated from learning, from course design, and especially when we're talking about students doing blended or fully online courses, and that's the question of motivation. So not just what students are doing, how they're spending their time, but also why are they doing it, right? What keeps them moving and putting in that effort, which is, I believe, the basis of all student accomplishment, full stop, right? It comes down to student effort, and we're the professionals who can set the conditions for that effort to come out. So hopefully some thought-provoking questions that we can file away. All right, so turning to those aspects of cognition, of thinking, of that kind of research that are, I think, most useful for what we do. So a little preview of each of these areas and maybe some somewhat provocative claims. Okay, so first off, attention. So this is one of those areas that the last 15 years have been just a gold mine for in psychology. We know so much about attentional processes and how that works and how it relates to other aspects of thinking. So really the story is one of anytime something important or interesting is happening in thinking, attention got there first on the scene. So to me, I look at it and say, you know, capturing student focus and student attention is a really important early precursor. So, you know, going out of the room and saying, well, for our purposes, just about nothing will happen unless students are focused. And I think this is kind of a new way of looking at things. When I started getting into this literature, I saw relatively little emphasis on this. So we'll get into that. Memory. I mean, this is more of a bread and butter issue for learning scientists, but also for cognitive psychologists. This is one that we've been researching for decades. And we know a ton about why we remember some things and why we forget other things, and how we can intentionally kind of hack those processes to make it more likely that we do retain information. Now, I always have to say, I don't want to get off on the wrong foot with anybody and kind of imply that learning is all about rote memorization, right? So any engaged teacher these days is going to reject that idea, and I want to stand with you on that. However, I do think more of us in teaching and learning are starting to say, you know what, it is not a dirty word to ask students to build a base of knowledge. You know, we say, well, do you want the higher thought processes, or do you want them to know the material? Why do we have to choose? Let's have both. So I think it's reasonable to have this be part of the planning process. Unless there are those higher thought processes, okay? And if you ask that, this is what we really, really want. You know, when I sit with faculty, as I have with many of my colleagues, it's like, what do you really want people to get out of Psych 101, or statistics, or this engineering course you've got? You know, when it really comes down to it, they say, I want them to be able to reason like a psychologist. You know, I want them to understand how engineers approach problems. That's what we want. And like a lot of things in life, though, just wanting something really badly is not enough to get to, right? So this is one where we know a lot about what the challenges are. And especially this rather frustrating fact that it doesn't fall out of the content knowledge. Now, increasingly we're learning in cognition that building that basic knowledge doesn't compete with being able to think in that area. It actually complements it. But it doesn't automatically happen. So just because a student has learned, of course, all these facts about research findings that other great psychologists have found, they've got that out of my Psych 101 textbook, that will not allow them to look at, say, a pattern of responses or a problem the way a psychologist would, right? It doesn't even advance in that part. So it doesn't fall out of content knowledge, but it is very easy to fall into the trap of teaching as though it does, right? Again, coming back to that content-driven design idea of, well, what textbook are we going to pick? All right? So those are some statements to set up a few take-home facts, ideas, and maybe even some tools to consider as we tackle these. So first off, taking this idea of attention, you know, how do you capture that focus? Couple of big picture points for you. And by the way, for those of you who can come to the workshop tomorrow, we're going to be taking a more in-depth look and doing some more hands-on stuff with the attention, memory, and motivation topics. So these are the highlights of it. So when I step back and I go, what does everybody really need to know out of this huge field? Well, one weird thing about the study of attention is that we don't really have a really good working definition of what it is. There's no spot in the brain that is the attention spot, and there's no real such thing as a set attention span in a certain number of minutes or anything like that. But, you know, like other things in life, we know it when we see it. So we know a huge amount about it. And one thing that does crop up over and over, and that can kind of help us as we think what is attention, is we do know what it's for. It's for prioritizing. So assuming that you really only have some finite amount of processing capacity, only so much information you can handle at once, you have to decide really on a millisecond by millisecond basis, where am I going to divide all this up? All right, so just kind of like a budget, sometimes you have a little bit spread over a lot of things, sometimes it's almost all exclusively concentrated in one spot. But you're always going through this process of allocating your resources. What's my priority? The other thing that really strikes me about the development of what we know about attention is how bound up it's become in the concept of working memory. So how many people have heard of that concept, working memory? Okay? So that's a pretty good one most people have run into. Well, how many people have heard this fact? Working memory holds around 7 items. I'm not going to ask you to endorse it or not, but all right, so here's one of the things that we've uncovered in the study of working memory and attention recently. This is that if you design the studies a little bit better, taking away some of people's fallback strategies and stuff, it may be more like 4 things. So that's probably a huge overestimate of like how much you could hold in your working memory actively at a time. And there's also a school of thought that says, really, maybe working memory is the same as attention. Maybe it's kind of what you're focused on internally at any given time. And what goes with that is, well, how many things can you really focus on at once? Any guesses? 1. Great. So we've gone from 7, maybe on the outside, 8 or 9, to 4 if you're lucky, to 1 thing. So, you know, that again places attention really centrally at any kind of process where we want to remember information and be able to work with it. And it's more limited than what we might realize. And as we'll kind of demonstrate in more detail tomorrow, we've also realized how little you encode or put into memory in the absence of focused attention. So especially if I'm processing something new, something novel, not routine, If I'm combining things in a new way, I've got to have attention focused on that for that to have any chance of sticking. So that kind of brings up just how crucial it is. And so I think, practically speaking, what can get in the way? We all only have so much, and we allocate it as best as we can. When is it less than optimal? I'll throw out another little hand-raised question. How many people have heard of the concept of cognitive load, right? Okay, so that's a pretty well-known theory around here. And I'm still kind of not totally in the camp of all aspects of what cognitive load theory has to say, but I think at a very basic level, it gives us this kind of rule of thumb idea to remember that whenever a student is in a learning situation, even if they're just really focused on what they're trying to learn, there's also stuff that kind of goes along on the sidelines that drains off that capacity. And that is sometimes stuff that we as designers of learning experiences can affect. So with any learning task, you have a certain amount of capacity that's around the learning itself, the so-called germane cognitive load. But then there's these other things that are draining off and competing with that. So things like, I'm trying to formulate this discussion response to this fascinating discussion prompt my professor put together, but I'm not quite sure where to find that in this fancy new BB learn system. All right, and there goes part of my capacity out the window. Yeah. Too soon? Sorry. You'll get over it. Soon enough. Give it time. Or another thing that is really drains off capacity is having the instructions for a task in a different physical spot than the information you need for the task itself. So you're looking up, you're looking over, and meanwhile you're losing out. So that can happen. There's also this issue of, as we would call it in psychology, automaticity of lower level processes. All right. Now, when it comes to the sophisticated things we want students to do, we don't want them to routinize that and just kind of sleepwalk through those higher thought parts of the assignment. But there are things that they should know they should have down cold. All right. And when they don't, then they have way less left over for what we do than what we would as experts. So, for example, in psychology, in what I'm doing, let's say I sit down to write a wonderful APA-style literature review, right? I'm writing that. Well, I don't have to stop and think about it every time I want to cite an author in text. I've got that, and I can focus on other aspects of what I'm doing, but students aren't in that situation. And I think that many of us, when we really kind of examine the skills we want students to have, we can identify more of those. So, quick shout out. What are some lower level skills that you think should, maybe in your discipline, students should have down cold? I can throw out some more examples for you. Yes?
Elementary algebra.
Elementary algebra. Yeah. All right. And we can always Google things, right? But if you have to stop and Google it, you have a problem. Yes, and that.
Writing a thesis statement.
Writing a thesis statement. That's, we already get that with routines, but some aspects of what to do and what not to do, if you didn't have to think about that anymore, wow, you'd have a lot left over for other things. I'll take one more. Yes?
How to use a source without plagiarizing.
Right.
Avoiding unintentional plagiarism.
Yeah. So most of us, it's second nature. We know when to use those quotes, when to use cut and paste, and when not to. So yeah, these are the kind of things. Or another example from one of my colleagues at NAU, Elizabeth Broward. She's an electrical engineer. Over there, she and I have had a lot of great discussions about her teaching and these kinds of issues. And there's something, for example, called Ohm's Law in circuit analysis. Some people are nodding, the rest are like me, they're not quite sure, but it sounds quite imposing, right? And she said to me a long time ago, she said, you know what? Well, my students, they sit down to do the homework and they're doing it, but they refuse to really memorize some of these processes. And if you have to look up Ohm's Law every single time you tackle a circuit, you are not going to last as an electrical engineer. All right, so that's something that I think is an intentional issue. And then there's this last bunch, what I would call kind of dysfunctional multitasking. So we don't tend to have really superb insight into how thinly we can spread our attentional capacities. We don't, and our students don't either. And so we make choices, either out of mistaken beliefs or just bad choices, that we're going to have, a cat video, we'll be texting 5 of my friends, and I'm going to be doing this OCamp homework at the same time, and what could possibly go wrong? So all of that stuff are questions that I think arise when we think about where's attention going during learning. So, kind of boiling this down into some suggestions, some food for thought that I want to throw out for you. What does that mean for actually what we do and don't do in our courses? So, I think the really basic one that I had to learn when I was designing some of my first online courses is asking students to respond. At a very basic level, nothing really grabs your attention like being on the spot that you're going to have to do something. The human mind is not set up to passively watch anything go by for any extended period of time. It has nothing to do with your generation, I don't think. We just aren't really wired to do that very well. We have to be involved in some way. So, for example, clicker systems, which I know are used by a number of classes here. When we brought those into our Psych 101 courses, one of the things that we polled students and did focus groups about was to ask them, how did this change the class experience for you at all? And the biggest thing that students said is it helped me, I was more attentive. Granted, this course was still a pretty large lecture-based class, but at least with that one initial step we took, we were helping students stay attentive to that material. Online as well. Asking students in that format, short answer, multiple choice, check for understanding, opinion, doesn't really matter, but making sure that we stop out and say, what did you think of that? Right? Looking at that extraneous load. Okay, try to put yourself in the shoes of that student who doesn't know how to use all the tools and can get really distracted. I've seen also suggestions such as, let's say that you have students who are learning a math principle or procedure, but they're also using a spreadsheet. Well, if they've never used a spreadsheet very much before, guess what? Now they're kind of juggling two things. So, while it's always good to embed skills into context, sometimes it makes sense to take care of the spreadsheet and instructions first before we tackle anything that's more conceptual. Looking at those lower level processes. So putting that in our planning process too, saying, let's break this down. What are all the things that have to go into successfully finishing this assignment, this skill, going through this experience? Those of you who do more sophisticated scaffolding, use that technique, then you're probably pretty familiar with this idea of saying, to me, writing an APA-style literature review, well, that's one thing, right? But all the stuff that has to go into that needs to be broken out and addressed. And some of it may make sense to create practice opportunities that help to make those automatic. Because it isn't just enough to tell students, you're not going to last as an electrical engineer, you got to memorize this. So, for example, Ruth Brower and I put together a set of homework assignments, which were just aimed at these principles that she wanted them to have down full. And interestingly, what she also did is she used BB Learn's capacity to tell us how long students spend on an assignment, to also incentivize speed, like it says up here. So students would get a certain number of points in this assignment, and they were told, keep attempting it, there's lots and lots of problems you can do. And their final score in that assignment was based not just on how accurate they were in their final attempt, but how fast they were. And that's really turning on its head what we usually tell students about their homework, right? To sit down, take your time, and that's oftentimes great advice. But sometimes you need students to be able to do things quickly, and if that's the case, build it into the assignment. And lastly, I think more of us are kind of looking at creative ways to tackle that issue of the choices students make about that dysfunctional multitasking, right? Sometimes we set policies in the classroom of no cell phones or something like that, and students may think, well, that's really about respect for the professor, which it is, and they don't see it from the perspective of learning. And importantly, If it's just about us policing them or telling them, you know, that's bad, using that device, that doesn't go home with them when they're doing their homework or their online course or their blended course. So helping students understand and set their own parameters around attention, I think is something that we can examine ways to do. So I'm going to put in a quick plug for this project, Attention Matters. So trying to put my money where my mouth was on that idea, I collaborated with one of our really smart instructional designers at NAU, John Doherty, and put together this module. We just call it a freestanding module. BB Learn, the way it runs at NAU is that it's a BB Learn course, but importantly, it's a course that students self-enroll in, and that can be dropped into any other course, say as an extra credit assignment, or some people, including myself, assign it as part of the class. So what it is a fully online set of materials that have a little bit of text, but a lot of demonstrations, and we'll see a couple of those in tomorrow's workshop, that really show students those principles of what you miss when you're not paying attention, that address myths like that you can just kind of learn in the background by osmosis. And also give students a few tools and ask them to reflect on what they're going to do going forward, including what they're going to do when it's a classmate that's distracting them, which is an issue a lot of our students struggle with. So this is still kind of in a beta testing or pilot phase, but we do distribute the materials to anybody who's interested. Just write me if that's something you want to see. All right, so moving on to some of our other topics, memory. So first is that attention and memory connection that we touched on. So we've moved away in the study of memory from thinking about it as this sort of bucket or filing cabinet where you can just sort of put certain amounts of information into, and more into a very functional view, all right? So asking ourselves, what is memory really for? So if we assume that memory is an adaptation in the mind that's there to help you survive, that kind of highlights some very different things about memory than just looking at it in that bucket or buffer kind of metaphor. So, you know, for our students and for our teaching, this does imply a few different things. So, you know, our mind is there to help us recall and then retrieve in the right circumstances information that relates to our goals and will help us live and pass along our genes another day. And so that throws into high relief the fact that we remember things when they do relate to something we're attempting to do right now, okay? And also to things like emotional punch, right? Emotions heighten memory, and this may be why, okay? So, you know, many times our students and we ourselves are trying to just sort of core information in there because we want it to be there. And the mind usually lets that stuff go. And it also lets things go when we don't have a structure to fit it into. So if it's not anything we understand, then we get rid of it. And then we act like memory had a failure, but that's not the case. That's the brain doing its job, right? If your brain just sort of hoovered up all this information indiscriminately, it wouldn't work very well from a functional standpoint. So goal relevance of memory. One that's a quirk of just some of the wiring of our brain is this visual superiority effect too. That we do tend to remember information better when it's presented visually or in visual format. And this is fantastic news in the new era of so much multimedia capability that we didn't have before. So there's so much we can do, especially with technology. It doesn't have anything to do with various learning styles. That's something that cognitive psychologists have always taken a very dim view of, and we believe even less with every passing day. So this is generally true across the board of most individuals. And lastly, there's a lot of really practical work from applied memory research, so research, you know, in very practical situations that I think that everybody should know and have a way to take advantage of. So I kind of call them the big three. So the first one is the testing effect. So how many people have heard of the testing effect? All right, anybody want to be brave and tell us what's the testing effect?
If you test something repeatedly, you learn more from it. So you can use the assessment to build and learn if you're clever about it.
Yeah, there you go. And yeah, so essentially a test, a quiz, or a test-like activity of any kind is just about the most powerful method for remembering that later than anything else you could do at that time. Full stop. I mean, this has been research that's emerged over the last decade or so, and it's just a slam dunk for applied memory research. And it doesn't even matter that much what the format of the test is, or even if you get feedback, which is also really good news. So this is very robust. This is not some delicate thing you have to do exactly right for it to help. So testing, quizzing, even self-testing really, really helps things to stick. And what really is going on, it has to do with retrieval, we call it retrieval practice. The situations where you have to actually dig in and get that information back. Then there's the spacing effect, or sometimes it's called distributed practice. And this is one that we've known about for a very, very long time. It's one of the old classic findings in psychology, and unlike 7 plus or minus 1, it's held up really well at time. And this basically says, when you have those study sessions with material, you get more out of it when it's spread over more sessions, it's spread over more time, even when the total amount of study time is held constant. All right? So this is one where the traditional advice to not cram is actually pretty well supported by research. Not always for the reasons people think, but so spacing is there too. And spacing is one, if you think about it, that we have a better than ever before opportunity to actually use. Right? So when I came into very traditional paper and pencil teaching, all you could do was yell at students not to cram. Unless they showed up in my office hours, I really had no idea what was going on. But now, I can really try to force multiple encounters with that material over the schedule that I choose. And as much as students will hang in with me with that schedule, then I've created spacing. Now, it does mean that we have to give students a little bit more support with calendaring and so forth, but that's something that we can do. And lastly, interleaving. This is one that's relatively new to the scene, but I think it's one to watch in the coming years. So interleaving becomes relevant for material where we are doing a couple of very specific things. So one case would be where we're learning categories. So let's say I'm learning how to tell different styles of art apart. Or one where I'm looking at different solution types. So let's say I'm learning statistics and I'm learning when to use different statistical tests. So the principle here is that you get more when you mix up those categories. Like you have a big deck of all the artists mixed up together rather than blocking. And I think this is a little remarkable because students subjectively feel like the better strategy is to block. So they're relatively unlikely to do this left to their own devices. But again, with greater control over the pacing of material and how and when we present it, we can take advantage of that. So practical principles I want to throw out to you. So I think that anybody who isn't harnessing this testing effect in one way or another is really missing out. Missing out on students remembering more in less time. And I think, just to editorialize a little bit, when we are shopping for textbooks, ancillaries, and all other kinds of tools, I think that that's one of the questions we should be asking, is how well is this going to allow me to harness this? More kinds of tests, more big banks of good questions to draw on, that's what we should really be looking for. And this is a change in mindset, all right? So more people are learning about the testing effect, and that's great, but it does require us to look at assessment in a different way. And for students, too. So you have to have that kind of beginning of the semester chat with students, as I have, and saying, well, here's why I test you on it before you really know it. Is because you're learning from it. Oh, that's very different than what they encountered in high school. Staggering those deadlines, trying a technique such as interleaving if you think your material falls into one of those categories where it's relevant. Other kinds of powerful processing that fit into that adaptive idea of why does our brain choose to hang on to certain information and let others go. So whenever we're asking people to do that more synthesizing processing, to examine underlying meaning, they do remember better. And especially if the material relates to themselves. I think this is one that most good teachers hit on a long time ago. But saying, how does this relate to your life, is one of the oldest tricks in the book for making material stick in memory research. And visuals as well, especially when we compare those with audio narration, say in an online slideshow. Research has shown that people get a whole lot out of that, more than they would by either alone. So visuals are great, narrated visuals are even better. And although this is tough, and I think more of us are still kind of looking for the best ways to do this, pre-assessing what students know before you try to add to that. And making sure our syllabi and how we frame the information doesn't lead up to the purpose of what they're learning, but that's presented up front. That gives us a memory advantage. Okay, last area of cognition. First, to really count. Those thinking and thought processes. So, this is a pretty big umbrella, right? A lot of things fit under this broad umbrella of thinking and have been areas for research in cognition. So everything from the formal reasoning, like what you'd see in a philosophy class, to practical problem solving, like you'd see in an engineering class, to critical thinking, and even analogies, where we map one type of solution or topic onto another. These are all what we mean by thinking, all areas where we have some really vibrant research findings. Now, one thing that comes out of the study of thinking is this kind of other maddening fact about thinking, besides that it doesn't come out of content knowledge, which is that it's extraordinarily context specific. So it's just not accurate to say, you teach somebody to think, they know how to think, they can go and they can think. Human thinking has our thought abilities have a very now you see it, now you don't kind of quality. So you may be able to think in engineering or in psychology or in mathematics, and it doesn't transfer. Now, from the expert's point of view, we almost always assume that transfer, taking it into a new realm, it's going to be easier than it is. And we go home and we think, wow, what we just learned in history class, that's going to transfer over to English class and how they even live the rest of their lives. Well, you're lucky if it goes into the next unit of history class, right? Let alone anything more than that. So, transfer problems, that's things like teaching your students, presenting a physics problem and you're thinking about it in terms of principles like velocity and acceleration. Students look at it and say, well, this is a problem about rocks or speedy bullets or a train. Those are the superficial details that tend to throw the novices off. Now, there aren't easy solutions or easy shortcuts in the teaching of thinking. And that's a very important point for us to keep in mind. So we'll be sure to carve out enough space in that course to address those. But a few things that help, a couple things that help. We do know that transfer is at least partially advanced when we can see beneath to those structural elements. So when we're able to look at any physics problem and say it doesn't matter whether it's a bullet or a rock or a train, here's the principles underneath. Or look at a psychology experiment and say, it doesn't matter if we're studying kids or old people or rats, here's the independent variable, and here's the dependent variable, and here's how we set up different conditions. That's the kind of expert thinking that allows transfer to happen. Then you can look at any project in that area, at least, and get to the bottom of it and not be thrown off and bound by the context in that way. So when we teach, focusing on those is important. Also repeated practice, like it says up here, across contrasting examples. So problems where the underlying nuts and bolts of the problem are the same and the superficial details are different, those are gold when you're teaching the problem solving. There's also critical thinking. All right, so how many people want their students to acquire critical thinking as part of what they do? Good. Good. All of us do. Now, a complication here with critical thinking, which is one of the most challenging areas in all of thinking, is that we don't have a common definition here either of what that means. So, and I think that's okay. different to critically think in psychology than it does in art history or engineering. And that is all right. It just means that we need to reflect, first of all, before we charge into the critical thinking topic, of what specifically does that mean. And we may not be able to borrow from another discipline or even another practitioner. And there are many, many barriers to this. So this is an area where a lot is going on in psychology right now. We've really tried to grab this challenge and run with it and really become leaders in the area of building critical thinking. But the more we research it, the more we run into things that are a barrier. So, and these are largely the ones that you will run into with your colleagues if you bring this up over coffee. All right, so real quick, raise your hand. What's one barrier to teaching critical thinking or your students learning critical thinking? What's one thing that you run into that's a difficulty? You put it in the syllabus, we're going to have critical thinking, we really value this. What happens? Yeah.
Such a general term, it's almost meaningless.
Yeah.
Like the scientists will say critical thinking is that.
Yeah, and your students are like, well, I don't know, I think I'll just try to look at the study guide and this critical thinking will just happen. So we don't know what it is. Yeah.
Over-focus on facts.
Okay, oh, you need the facts, but overly focusing on that and refusing to go beyond, yeah, that.
I teach a drawing class, and I want my students not to just see a collection of different objects. I want them to see the relationships between them.
Yeah, so you're asking for a lot more than that basic level of processing. Yeah.
The urgency of it and whether or not the example would occur in the real world.
Okay, yeah.
Practice. It seems like practice rather than.
Yeah, so are you going to do it? And students may value it very differently than you do. Yeah.
It's hard to find a good way to measure progress
Yeah.
in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, we know it when we see it. We can look and say, you didn't get it. I know the facts are that you didn't critically think, but what does it mean to a student? And one more.
I was going to say the design and then the evaluation and feedback, the time on task for faculty to do that for large groups.
Yeah, and there is where the no quick fix problem really gets thrown up into high relief. There is a good literature on addressing different challenges within critical thinking. But yeah, it isn't a matter of just giving them that one magic explanation, which is what I tried to do. You know, when I first came into this, I'm like, we're going to have a critical thinking day. Well, check that out. We did that. And I get the exams back and I'm like, great, what happened? I explained critical thinking to them. So yeah, it is a practice issue. And it is, like it says up here, also an issue of not just how to, which is hard enough, but when to. All right? So what we found in the study of this is it isn't always that students didn't understand, say, correlation versus causation. That's a big deal in critical thinking and psych. It's that they can do that when I tell them, okay, look and tell me, is this really causation in this problem? But when they see the next thing, I'm not there to tell them to do it, even though they can, they don't, right? So we're not going to unpack all the things that the literature has told us about critical thinking. But this is one where if you want to make any kind of headway with this, you really got to identify your goals and have students practicing with those specific skills. So we'll get into those on this next slide. So how do you actually apply some of this, given that it's a powerful challenge? So I do think that this skill mentality, what should they be able to do, not just what they know, all right? Teaching them how we think, not just how we know, does break us out of that content mindset and start to open up that space we're going to need to tackle this stuff. And it sounds very, very simple to say, figure out what you want students to be able to do and then have them practice that. Sounds simple, but so many times we stray off of that. So aligning the learning activities, thinking about where they spend their time, they should be spending time on those things. I mean, I put up here this example of critical reading. This is one that, as I talk to faculty, so many people say, oh, it's critical reading. I mean, I send them home with reading, and even if they do it, they come back and it didn't sink in, by which they mean the students didn't do with it what they, as an expert, would do. So breaking the thing down into, oh, here's the topic sentence, here's supporting evidence, here's something that I agree or disagree with. That's what we do, but they cannot do that without scaffolding. So something like a shared annotation assignment, where students make very explicit and are asked and held accountable to do those processes. may be a good way to target those skills. Remember that transfer, that big, huge, frustrating problem of transfer, is aided by practice across varying problems. And it also turns out, by the way, there's a little bit of research that shows that quizzing as well, that testing effect, also helps a bit with transfer. So that's a twofer, right? So another good reason to use quizzing. Making that structure visible. So transfer also aided by focus on underlying structure. So get creative with how we can visualize that. So for example, if I've got two math problems that are very similar or have corresponding elements, I'm hoping students kind of see that. Well, why not set up some multimedia where I actually physically show a connection from one to the next? It's all about the structure, okay? And if I want people to get over that when to as well as the how to of a critical thinking problem, remember that that's got to be baked into my assignment too. I've got to sneak up on students and not always give them the clue that here's what I want you to do, right? And lastly, because thinking skills can be very context specific, if you're in a discipline where you really need students to transfer over into, say, a practical application, then your class is going to need to have some really realistic scenarios for that practice. So how many people have ever used either case studies or problem-based learning in their classes? All right. And if you've done that, even on a small scale, you see how students really start to exercise those thinking abilities in ways that they didn't before. And that's the sort of thing that has a little bit better chance of transferring if they tried it in that kind of quasi-realistic environment. All right, so lastly, this motivation question. So when I got into this question of, how can I help provide a framework for course design and addressing these questions, I never once thought that I would be addressing motivation. And for one thing, I'm a cognitive psychologist and, as a disciplinary expert, I want to stay in my lane, right? And so this is a side of psychology that, I was going to stay away from, but I realized you can't. You've got to talk about that motivation side. So this is another that we're going to really delve into at tomorrow's workshop. But here's a few things to take home as ideas and principles that I think are very useful. So of course, we've all heard of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivations. And that's still a good heuristic that stands up, right? We're motivated by things like points and am I going to get a job? And also, this is really interesting. But these days, many psychologists take a nuanced view of this. So extrinsic motivations are not a dirty word, right? Sometimes extrinsic and intrinsic motivations are tied to each other. Maybe I want a really good grade in my research methods class, not because I'm dying to learn about ANOVAs and t-tests, but that might get me into a good grad school, and then that ties to how I want to help children with autism in schools. Right? And so those are the kind of networks of interlinked motivations that we can acknowledge in students and try to take advantage of. Self-determination theory. This is another that I think is a good one because it asks us to look at environments that are motivating. And it's a very top-level general principles of when people tend to be more motivated in environments. So people tend to be most motivated, most willing to put forth effort when they feel competent, they feel like they're catching on to something, right? Can do it. Relatedness, so there's a social component. We are, after all, social creatures. So when I can share my accomplishments with somebody else or have a common goal with them, I tend to be motivated. And autonomy. So it's up to me. I have some choices in that. So, those are some others that are real food for thought for what we can do. Academic self-efficacy. How many people heard of this one? Self-efficacy? All right, so this is basically an academic version of this, another very classic, very robust idea in social psychology, the self-efficacy idea, which is kind of the little engine that could principle. So, again, we put forth most effort, and we're most motivated when we feel like we can do something. And this is not just thinking positive or being confident. It's really more about seeing an effect of what we do, right? And that kind of makes sense from an adaptation standpoint. Sure, you should be most willing to expend effort when you can see it has some kind of an impact. If what you're doing is not having any kind of an impact, you should probably redirect it somewhere else. So in the academic context, this means building this idea and mindset with students that it's up to you. You know, it's not up to me to give you the grade, that when you do this, this happens. And it's also not about getting all the way to mid-semester and going, well, I have a C on the midterm, now I guess all is lost or something. But saying, well, you always have a chance to do something and see some kind of an effect, right? So academic self-efficacy is another one I think is important. And lastly, that idea of mindset. And here I won't even ask for a raise of hands because this has been, rightfully so, a wildly popular idea in education of late. And like self-efficacy, you know, it has to do with really fundamentally believing that your achievement in an area is up to effort and choices that you make instead of, say, inborn ability. So if you haven't gotten a chance to, for example, see any of Carol Dweck's work, she actually has a book called Mindset, very readable, wonderfully written and so creative an application of her theory. Then I'd advise that you take advantage of that as well. So I'm much more motivated, and I also respond to feedback a lot better when I can see, yeah, I can do better next time by trying or having more effort. If it's really just about finding out, am I really good at math like they said in high school, then tests become very fraught with anxiety, and when I get bad feedback, I'm much more likely to quit instead of trying harder next time. So all of these things are some of those key take-homes that all of us need to have. So here's an idea that I've really started to push with a lot of my colleagues. So there was a time when, you know, learning objectives were the new thing. You say, well, I picked a textbook, why do I also have to make this list of objectives? And these days it's mainstream. We know that you go into a course and you say, I want to have a plan for what I'm hoping students master, or what they're able to do, and we list those things out. And that's part of our process. Well, why don't we also have a motivational plan? Some kind of a framework that we set up for ourselves to say, here's how I'm going to make sure that students are less likely to procrastinate. Here's how I'm going to make sure that they don't get discouraged. Here's how I'm going to increase the chances that they spend more time and spend it more productively. And that will look very different depending on what you're teaching, your preferences, your students' needs, and so forth. It's not about getting to the one right answer, but it's about taking the time, just like we do with thinking skills, to carve that out and say, yes, this is worth having a plan ahead of time, rather than trying to correct it after the fact. Here's another one that I think that has really caught on at my institution. And we just call it the early and often principle. All right, recalling that assessments do all these great things when we use them right. They also give students early feedback about how they're doing. And even when that feedback isn't great, it does show them that their actions had a consequence. And it highlights what they might do next time. I even think that this helps us teach mindset. You know, we tell students, oh, it's all about the effort you put in. That's how you get a good grade. But then look at how we might structure it. We say, well, here's this one big assignment at the end of the semester. You turn that in. For the student, it looks like, well, either you're a genius and that works out great from the get-go, or you're not a genius and it doesn't. But how does it look and what message does it give when we say, hey, we're going to have drafts. And I don't care how great your draft is. Everybody gets comments, and your grade is partially determined by how you address those. Right? We're going to have a quiz every week. You flunked one? Oh wow, big bummer. Let's try again next week. So walking the walk as well as talking the talk with mindset and effort. So I think nobody has one magic answer with self-efficacy. That's a big aspect of student psychology. But here too, I think that what we do in a class also telegraphs what we think about the student's responsibility for their own grade. So things like having rubrics and sharing those with students, saying, here's what I'm looking for. Grade yourself. You can grade this assignment about as well as I can because we both know what it's about. Making the grading as transparent as possible. I mean, many of us consider this as best practice for other reasons, but it also takes that mystery and takes that out of the realm of Dr. Miller gave me this mystery grade to I made this grade for myself. And assigning students to reflect or even have a wrap-up assignment. I've seen this called by, well, I think it was Linda Nilsson who calls this a test postmortem, kind of a gory idea, but she says after a test, you go back and say, well, if it wasn't what I wanted, what happened? What was the cause of death? What led up to this? Unless I think, especially in the online environments where procrastination is an issue, and students are doing the work after they've been to their job and they've taken care of their kids and they've done everything else, having certain things be routine, taking advantage of habits and how those put less of a drain on our willpower, right? So when students are kind of in an absolute mindless routine of every day I have to check into the psych class, it becomes a little less of a battle every time they want to do that. So thinking about, what do you want students to be doing every week or every day? And continually putting that in front of them from day one that they're accountable to do that. It won't reach all students, but it'll smooth the way a little bit for the others who may be struggling. All right, so with that, our food for thought, and I think we will take questions. All right, so thank you so much for your engagement so far. All right, more thoughts? Yes, Jack.
Well, I drove a lot to hear this talk.
Okay. No pressure.
Now I'm working with an ed tech company
Yeah.
on engaging students with online learning strategies. There's a book here that I'd like to share with people, and it's Mind on Numbers by Barbara Oakley from Oakland University. But here's my question. Have you experimented with having the students create ways of solving a problem and sharing that with other students? And it has to be documented with one person taking a picture of what the student is doing. So I have in real time that they're doing their work and they're hopefully understanding it. And they have to cite strategies like Wolfram Alpha, YouTube, or all of these hacker-like mentalities to get this. They know that I know that. So have you experimented with having the students create these innovative strategies for passing this class? One last thing is, we ask these students, we tell these students about these nice learning strategies. I'm experimenting with now giving them these learning strategies and asking them to do a reaction paper for that. And I'm getting some responses here that are very, very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so bring this in. So, take the easy answer for some. No, I haven't experimented with having students video themselves in real time. And whenever we get into the synchronous stuff, it balances against that wonderful flexibility and individualize this and that students really prize, and that's why they're in the online class sometimes. But I think that is a new level that as more people do this, more students will come to expect and accept it. In face-to-face classes, of course, I'm a big relier on case studies, as we were talking about before the talk, even quick little scenarios. So like in a study skills class, one of the big problems that we see, and that I'm definitely seeing in some of my students, is they've had study skills before. They had it in high school. Somebody sat them down and said, oh, do flashcards. And they know that's what you want to hear, and so they kind of regurgitate some really generalized stuff. We want them to get more disciplinary specific stuff and more research-based stuff. It is surprising. Stuff like the interleaving effect that doesn't seem intuitive at all. We want them to know that stuff. So I do a certain amount of presentation of that, but then we sit them down and say, okay, here's a scenario about some guy named Alex, and he's got this issue, and he's flunking out of this class, and here's what he tends to do. You sit down and tell me what Alex ought to do instead. And for students, we can't forget, too, that especially when it comes to some of these academic practices, I feel that it is an emotionally fraught area for some of them, right? And I can come charging in, I do this stuff all the time, it's not emotional for me, but this is personal stuff. So I feel that sometimes allowing themselves to distance from it a little bit. So instead of like, how are you gonna study better, young man? Saying, oh, here's this hypothetical person. Well, you're becoming an expert in that. What would you prescribe for that person? That's a little bit of a shift that I find productive. All right? Okay, so good start to our discussion. All right. Yes?
I just wanted to ask for a little clarification.
Sure.
So when you were talking about the learning objectives, typically those are an institutional mechanism, but also something that we've placed very prominently on our syllabus as kind of a, this is the skill set you get for your money, right?
Yeah.
You compare that to the motivational plan.
Yeah.
Is that something that is presented to a student, or is that something that's internally for the instructor? Where's that situated?
I think it would be situated with the instructor. But I'm open to suggestion on that. I mean, it always works better when we collaborate with our students towards common learning goals. Maybe there are some practices that people have used that we could share in our cocktail hour and also in our workshop and in our after conversations about how to do that. I mean, there's been a lot of work on wording of syllabi and things like that. And even things like how to get into a discussion forum and, not have it come across terribly, and that sort of thing. But what sorts of other information should we place in there? I guess there's also the learning contracts, the in-class constitutions, and things like that really address more the individualized expectations. But how would it look to say, here's the structure of the class, here's what's going to be hard, and here's how I want you to get over it. Or even something like a philosophy. Like, I believe that all students can learn college algebra. I'm positive of that, and so can you, and here's how it's going to happen. I think there's still work to be done. I saw one of the things that got me interested in this is, as I was going through all those factoids and reports that people like the Babson group come up with on online learning, one of the things they did is they asked campus academic officers, presidents and provosts, what did they think was the biggest barrier to online learning expanding more? And the top answer was motivation. And when we're out in public kind of talking, the hype is all, it's the tech, it's the, let's all have MOOCs, let's do this and that. When people were really kind of answering anonymously, they said, yeah, but you have to sit at home and do it. And until we have that problem knocked, we've gone as far as we can. So I think this is really the next frontier for engaged practitioners. Yes?
You mentioned interleaving.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite catch what it is. Could you talk just a couple minutes about that?
Yeah, so interleaving is the way to control the sequencing of either studying things or preferably something like a self-quiz. So imagine a student has made a stack of flashcards. And imagine that they made these lovely flashcards with a painting on the front and the name of the artist on the back, and they're going to go through them. You can either stack those cards up, so we do all the Rembrandts, and then we do all the Monets, and then all the Cassattes, or you shuffle them. And then with everyone I have to go, oh, is that Monet or Cassatt? So when I'm studying them, I'm going at it about that way. Or if it's problem solving, let's say that I have a set of homework problems in my research methods class. Look at each one of these and tell me the statistical test that's appropriate for these data. And maybe have them work through it. They're going to get more bang for the buck if I mix it up and I don't tell them, okay, we're going to have all the t-tests together, all the ANOVAs together, all the chi-squares together. And one of the things that contributes to that, we think, and we're still really figuring this one out, is there's so-called desirable difficulty. That's a little catchphrase that's gotten popular in memory research. It's just harder, It's just harder when I look at it and I have to rack my brain for what kind of problem is it. But I think it really maps onto something that I have heard from faculty, which is that rote idea that, if I sit them down and say, okay, do this with this information, they can and they will. But if they're just looking at it, they just sit there. So I suspect that that's another area where interleaving comes into play. Yeah.
the frequency of testing.
Yeah.
I feel that there's a lot of too frequent testing
Yeah.
has an adverse effect, and students tend to. Some people take a longer time
Yeah.
for these things to filter into
Yeah.
to really learn things at a deep level.
Yeah.
That time scale is different for different people.
Yeah.
And if you have a quiz every week or anything like that, I think that's ridiculously short, right?
Yeah.
And I'm interested to hear your opinion.
Yeah, and I'm kind of biased because this is such a powerful finding, but it is also fraught and complicated by all the drama going on in K through 12 over
That's very
standardized testing, and our students come out of that system, and K through 12 is not my area, and I won't editorialize about that in that context. But I do think that. I do think it's a different philosophy. That's not why frequent testing occurs, and I don't think it's framed as part of the learning. If anything, I think that what you're saying is a good reason to broaden the frame of what a test is. It's really about retrieval practice. When we look at it cognitively, it's not about the number of the score, the format, whether it's nationally or none of that matters. It's did you have to close the book and try to remember it on your own? And I think that what's really compelling about this too, it makes it really urgent, is that surveys have shown that this is one of the things that students are least likely to do on their own. So left to their own devices in that X number of hours they're supposed to be spending, their top strategy is rereading with a highlight. And reading is great, critical reading is even better. Rereading over and over and over gets them nothing for that time. So even if it is just using the classic PQ4R technique of reading, where the last part is you kind of recite, you say, what did I get out of that? Even something like that, I feel, fits under that broadened frame of what is a test. So maybe even folding it under some other term or concept and calling that active learning, active studying, I'd go for that. I'm just very loath to pull back from something that I think would give students a good return if, in building up their knowledge base. So those are just some reactions and some thoughts.
You mentioned in the talk, I think it's really important, and I struggle with it myself when I go to talk. And
Yeah.
the distractions for multitasking.
Yeah.
And this is my problem with technology in the classroom as well. How do we use it as a tool instead of just another distraction?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that, but I've shown my students the studies on how they're not the multitaskers, and they're always shocked, but then they think, well, but that doesn't apply to me because I really can do all of this all at the same time. I find myself doing it and I wonder how to address that.
I think a lot of that does come down to active learning and staying out of the realm, as John and I talked about, of reefer madness. Of, oh my God, that phone is going to rot your brain. It's got to be involving and it's got to be credible. And the Attention Matters module has, we show them, we don't tell them, and I don't assign them any research. I kind of even stay away from that word research. I want them to take a whole class in cognitive psychology. That would be wonderful, but if they're not going to do that, I want to have them, like, for example, John found this fantastic video of the amazing texting and driving test. Have you seen that one? Right, and so the setup is, and it's all in French, we had it subtitled. They sort of pump some driving students and tell them that, well, because so many people text and drive, that's part of the test now. So you're going to have to send these texts, I tell you, while you go around with an officer in the car, and people are shrieking about what a bad idea it is, driving over cones. And, will it transform what a student does the next day in class? I think we still need to look at that. But it really makes that point about you can't be everywhere at once the way you think a little bit better. And we take advantage, too, of this effect in psychology, which is what we call the hypocrisy effect. It's a lot more persuasive if I say, let's all write a letter home about how we're managing distractions in our classes. The setup is your family has made all these sacrifices for you to come here. How are you going to get more for your money? Yet, I'm asking the student to tell me what I want to hear. And they may or may not, say they believe that. But once you've said that, once you've written home and said, dear mom and dad, I'm really trying to do the best I can with all the time and effort, and I appreciate your support. And one of the things I'm doing is I've made a pledge to myself that I'm going to put my cell phone in my backpack every time I start class. I'm going to turn it off so it doesn't buzz and put it in my backpack. And that's my way, And I think also making it concrete. That's one of the things we also ask them to do as part of that module. So instead of saying, I pledge not to be distracted and not to use my devices, we go for those concrete, specific, measurable goals. Things like putting the phone in the backpack, which a lot of our students have opted for. Or some say, you know what, when I have a choice, I'm going to take paper notes instead of a laptop, and here's why. So pushing them to do those kinds of things, instead of kind of swooping in with the whole breakdown of all the information, I think is a little bit helpful. Yeah, but it's, here too, I know, I love the BYOD activities that I do at conferences, and we do some of them too, and I say, this would be so great, and let's just all Google and small groups would be great. But I know, just like with us, once it comes out, there's the text and there's the email, and now the bye-bye for a little while. Yeah. Yes.
No, I only pulled my phone out just now.
I'm not
I
sure.
couldn't remember this word.
Yeah.
It's the spaced repetition system that I know I used when I was studying language and I used it teaching language. And I'm wondering if there's ways to apply that to other types of things. I don't know. Like, I'm an art historian.
Oh, you're an art historian, okay. But you teach languages as well?
Well, I used to.
You used to, okay. Just to kind of make a reflective comment, when I talk to people who are in the language teaching and learning field, they have just really been light years ahead of the rest of us and really systematic approaches, I guess out of necessity of what they teach. So I think you find somebody who's teaching French or Spanish or Italian, and they're like, you're not going to learn this by cramming once every 3 weeks stuff. But the rest of us are catching up now. So spaced repetition system sounds just right. Like testing though, this is another very robust bomb-proof effect. Doing it a little bit of an attempt to do it is better than not doing it at all. So it doesn't have to be in a precise system. I like to market this one to students too, as, hey, this is great news for all those busy lives you keep talking about. Okay, so you're working 2 jobs and you're taking 5 classes, and the only time you can study is on the bus. Great. Guess what? You're going to get more out of that. All you have to do is plan for it. 15 minutes in between all the other stuff you got to do. Actually, that's great. So, kind of phrasing in a positive way. Marketing. Yeah. Good. I think we have one more. Yes.
This was more specific. Very early on, we were talking about the instructor you worked on with the Ohm's law and the idea of timing exams. I'm just wondering what you were using as a baseline to determine how long it should take students to ideally finish that such that they would get full credits. And obviously, everybody works at their own pace, and also you have special needs mixed in there as well.
We didn't go, and this was a couple years ago, so I probably won't be able to give you all the details without kind of going back to my own notes. We didn't make it a time limit. I think she looked first, just empirically. Because she'd been doing these in an online system for years, she had a really good sense of what's slow, what's medium, and what's fast. And she was just real generous about that. As for setting a timer or something like that, you're like, out of time. I don't know if that would have the same effect.
Well, I was meant more what you were using as the baseline time to judge against. It sounds like she was using historical data that she personally had collected.
Yeah, and she was teaching in a small class environment, so she had more latitude than many other people would to say troubleshoot if anything did come up and somebody did have a problem with it. But also key was the repetition. And that's another one that I really think is a great option across a lot of situations, is why not give multiple attempts? And I have some people who are very tentatively saying, well, they'll have 1 or 2 retakes. I have infinite retakes. It's like, oh, they'll see the question, and it's different questions every time. Oh, they'll learn how to do it. Well, yeah. I wish they were going to suddenly know that. And here, it's mindset. Keep trying. And so that cures some of the angst that students come to an assignment like that with. Say, oh, you drew a bad question that was terrible? Your roommate walked in on you, your computer crashed? Oh, okay, do it again. You know, why not? So we had that philosophy, I think, on our side as well. But it's data that a lot of us don't exploit, you know? And when we do start looking at the timing of how long did it take us to do this, instead of kind of going on their word, that diagnoses a ton about what the underlying issue is. Simple principle, falls out of the technology you now have, all we have to do is use it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.